So welcome everybody to our bi-weekly webinar that Jim and I host. My name is Ryan Poole. I'm an active real estate agent, been doing this for over 20 years, just like you out there trying to make deals happen. I'm also the founder of Real Trade, which is an online marketplace and social media platform for real estate. So I want you to check out that. As we're the home of the double dip, as Jim says. You can get free leads and you can connect with other service providers like Jim and Jeff on this call. I tell you, think of it as Zillow, different business model mixed with LinkedIn for only real estate. And I want to welcome you here to our bi-weekly webinar. And I want to introduce you to Jim. So people don't know Jim, quintessential entrepreneur. Not only is he a real estate attorney, he's owns his own title company called New Path Title, and he's actually developed and founder of an awesome closing software called Title Leap, which is like a free contract coordinator. So we host this bi-weekly webinar to add value to agents. One of Jim's favorite sayings, iron sharpens iron. We're learning from each other. This topic here, I tell you, I've been in the industry over 20 years. Things are moving so fast, obviously, with the NAR settlement and everyone's happy. We've all been following that closely. But now we have some new addendums. We have a new contract that's come out. So it's pretty awesome that we have a real estate attorney with over 20 years of experience that's going to be able to go over this and bring some clarity and help us agents. So go ahead, Jim, take us from there.
I hate to say this, you guys. It's 20 years in solo practice, 40 years in the industry. It just blows my mind. Sorry, I'm so casually dressed. My wife and I are out of town for our 25th wedding anniversary. We're in Quebec, Canada. And I have to say, I don't know how big real estate is in Canada right now, but the people here are awesome. The weather, it's super cold, but you'll never find friendlier people than you find in Canada. So it's a really nice
Jim, I think your wife just left you.
place.
She waved at
Hopefully that's only temporary. All right, so I want to start by saying, you guys, here's the important thing for me is this is the highlight of my career, right? And this is what I like doing the most. And so it's my pleasure to be able to bring you guys perspectives you won't hear anyplace else. So I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to tell you stuff that my goal is you can't hear anyplace else, and I'm going to try to give you guidance that will make you guys more efficient, sharper agents. Like Ryan said, I believe truly iron sharpens iron. All those texts you guys send me at 9 o'clock at night, and you start by so sorry, just say, here's the question, because it really is fuel for the fire for all of us. There are no dumb questions. I'm going to try to get you guys out of here in 45 minutes, unless you guys want more. If you turn on your camera, I can always see the feedback. You guys can, if it's uncomfortable, don't do it. But if you can turn on your cameras, I can see the feedback. It allows me to move quicker. At the end, we're going to go over some time-saving tools for you guys. And you can always text me your future topics and text me, and you can throw them in the chat, stuff you guys want to hear about in the future. Unfortunately, this time frame we're in right now is pregnant with future topics. And in preparing for this one, I've not stumbled onto, but unearthed several more that we'll go over for the next several weeks. And we may have to do an interim meeting because there are some new forms coming out that I was just presented moments before this podcast on the new October 1st law changes in laws to the seller's disclosures and seller flood disclosures and seller condo disclosures. So having said that, let's jump right into today's topic.
Share your screen, Jim. Yep, there we go.
Yep, I'm in a hotel room, you guys. I'm sorry if it's a little glitchy today. But I was going to postpone the session, but I thought there's so much stuff here that we just can't do it. So regardless, we're here and we're doing it together. Ryan, I can't see while I'm on this screen. I can't see what's going on the big screen. So
yeah, I can see it scroll up to the top. Yep, there you go.
Yep, sorry about that. Whoop. Don't even know what I just did.
There you go. There we are.
Yeah.
Great headline. Great headline, Jim.
All right. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the pool, FAR brings out 2 new addendums and a contract. We're going to go over some stuff in the meantime. And again, I'm going to try to keep this one shorter than most. The date is September 24th. That's incredibly relevant. Stuff's changing so quickly that podcasts we've done over the last 2 or 3 sessions are now dated. I'm sorry. We're going to do a wrap up at some point soon, but right now we're just trying to keep up with the snowball. Florida realtors used to update the contract form every 2 to 4 years. These days, however, we're looking at several new forms a month. The final Sitzer NAR settlement approval is not due until November 26, 24. The rules we are operating within today are trial rules, test rules. They are designed to see how we will react as agents. These are not the final rules. And November 26th may get kicked out. There is a method to the madness, I believe. Is this improved at all, Ryan, if I do this?
There you go. Yeah.
There is a method to the madness, I believe. Believe it or not, we will get there. These are just baby steps, in my opinion. We are headed for what's called uncoupling. If anybody doesn't know what uncoupling is, don't feel bad. It's very simple. In the world of uncoupling, only buyers pay buyers' agents. Whoops.
Mhm.
Only sellers pay sellers' agents, and sellers' agents don't pay buyers' agents. I don't see how a rule against seller paying buyer's agents is not a restraint on trade and unlawful. There's a new FTC czar. I don't remember her name. I believe it's Lydia. She's 32 years old. She is very much in favor of small business. And I don't see how she would get behind 32 years old. It's amazing. I don't see how she would get behind a law created so that sellers couldn't pay anybody they want to pay. In other words, that to create a law saying things can't happen, in my opinion, that's an unfair restraint on trade. A couple of brokerages see the way I see it, and I don't want to name their names, but there are some very active brokerages, and it's just a matter of time. And I think that's what we're gonna get behind.
No, there's some big name box brokerage guys that now have made it as part of their policy that the listing agent doesn't offer buyer's agent commission. If the seller wants to offer it, they can, but it does come from the seller. It's obviously detailed in the new listing agreements, which we've had webinars, Jim, on over. So
Well, I think we got to do like a roundup when the dust settles.
Yeah.
Maybe not next
Yeah.
week. Next week we'll go over the new October 1 laws and the 2 new forms coming out under the laws. But then we should really do because I get a number of texts. I was in the airport. I actually received 4 or 5 texts from agents saying how they hated the new rules, and the double dip is dead. That is not the case. There is no lawful reason why you can't collect seller and buyer's agent commissions. We've done it in past podcasts. We'll break it out again in the future very shortly. In the meantime, we'll just try keeping up with the forms as they come out. Just when you thought Sitzer NAR lawyers could not get any more ridiculous, I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer. I have a hard opinion on this. I think this is lunacy. They want another $16 million in attorney's fees on top of the settlement amounts. In their request for attorney's fees, on top of the settlement amount, which we know what those numbers were, they want $350 an hour for a paralegal. They want $950 an hour for associate attorneys. They want $1,050 an hour for staff attorneys. They want almost $1,500 an hour for Michael Ketchmark, who is the attorney who's been on all the podcasts and all the forward-facing discussions on the news. And the senior attorney, who we've never heard from, is billing for $2,200 an hour.
How do we become attorneys, Jim? How do we become
Full
attorneys?
stop, hard pause. What world do I not live in that I should be living in as an attorney?
Yeah.
Here's the real getcha. The judge authorized 25% to 30% of the settlement can be paid to the attorneys as a contingent fee. Isn't this a commission?
Of course it is.
How ironic is it when they are trying to compress real estate commission fees? So the judge rules on the commissions available to attorneys, and the only rulings we've seen are against agents that want it, and the whole commission issue. The irony is just too much for me to bear. All right, another topic that we've talked about recently, Landian. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. The videos and the social media appear to have slowed down. I said it last week, I'll say it again. I went on their site. You have nothing to fear. Landian does not appear to be a threat to agents at all. I booked a tour. They never even contacted the listing agent. I have after several days, they contacted me through multiple medias. They were obviously disconnected on their messaging, but they said they're not serving the West Palm Beach market, and they had no plans to be serving the West Palm Beach market. Ryan, I don't have the
Well,
screen
just
of all the agents, so if anybody's raising their hand or has questions, let me know.
yeah, they're going to put them in the chat. If you have questions as we go, guys, put in the chat or raise your hand. But I will just say, Landy, just so people don't know, was a startup trying to disrupt the buyer's agent space. And ironically, the guy Sitzer, who started the whole class action lawsuit against NAR, was one of the founders. Anyway, let's keep going. Let's keep going, Jim. Let's keep going.
All right, so New Path Title offers an industry-first closing cost calculator. I'm going to show you this now because it's going to become very relevant when I show you the new forms. So we offer a closing cost calculator modification where concessions and separate buyers and sellers agents compensations can be found. These are old links. Everything's changing so fast. Here's the good link. It's at newpathtitle.com, and you click on the closing cost calculator in the upper right-hand corner. Literally, as we're preparing for this session, the rules, we're making modifications to our software. So here's the calculator. Sorry for the pauses. I have to wait for certain features on my computer to reside. So you go to newpathtitle.com. You're going to see the closing cost calculator, the calculator symbol in the upper right-hand corner. You're going to click on that. Whether you're representing a seller or a buyer, you're going to click here. And if you're representing the seller, you're going to punch in a sale price. You're going to punch in the seller realtor commissions. In this box, it's going to default to percentages. We're still doing the programming, but the percentage symbol will appear, and you can punch in a percentage. The buyer realtor commission operates the same way. You're going to punch in a number, and that's going to appear there. So that's the seller commit. You're on the seller side calculator. You're going to punch in a seller commission. You're going to punch in a buyer commission, and you're going to punch in a transaction fee. If your firm has one, this will default to a $sign. And then here you're going to punch in the famed seller concession. And the reason why all this stuff will be more apparent as to why we had to break out the seller's commission and the buyer's commission is because we're going to go over some forms where it talks about how to handle these separate values. And yes, although commission was a taboo word in a podcast 4 or 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, now you're seeing the term commission appear everywhere in the Florida forms and compensation. So again, at the speed with which things can change, things are changing. You go down to the bottom of the form. Actually, you say, is the property in a HOA or a COA? No. Who's paying for the compensation? And is the property in Miami-Dade? Actually, we'll click no. When you click go, now you're going to get a detailed breakdown of the compensations, the closing costs, and at the very end, you're going to see seller concessions, realtor transaction fees, seller realtor commission, buyer realtor commission. And that's going to give you the ability while you're sitting in front of your buyers and sellers to do things agile at the listing appointment and nail that listing. We also have the same exact set of forms for the buy side.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to add, Brian Pruitt had a quick question. Can you on the closing cost calculator, can you do the ability to compare multiple offers? I guess.
Sure. You just punch in different values, and every time you punch in a value, if you want to leave it with your client, you can print it or send it to them via email.
Cool.
Here you're going to be able to punch in the sale price and the loan amount and the transaction fee like we talked about before. Again, the percentages and the $signs will appear here shortly. And then the buyer's agent fee. And then here, the famed seller concessions. So when you're talking to your buyer about what you want to see for seller concessions, you can punch in any value here. Who is paying for title insurance? In Palm Beach County, it's typically the seller. We'll go over in a minute how you can change that. And then when you punch go, you'll come to the very bottom and you'll see that the seller concession is a subtraction from the total. Now, everybody can do the math, but everybody knows that a visual is way more powerful than just stating something and leaving it in space. So we built this for you guys so you can go out and you can win your buyers, sellers, and have those negotiations more easily. Angela's in the waiting room. Come on in, Angela. So that's our closing cost calculator. We're going to add the symbols shortly. Another thing I want to go over before we go over the main topic, October 1st, the new flood law disclosure and condo disclosure laws are going to go into effect. There are new forms. I was served them just moments before the podcast. I'm thinking about having another podcast on October 1st, which would be next Tuesday. I'm away this week. I want to digest what's going on and then have something meaningful next Tuesday. Maybe by a show of hands or mention in the chat if you guys want to do it Tuesday, or I would much rather do it Tuesday and have back-to-back 1 week meetings instead of going 2 weeks and then being a week into October. So let's just plan on doing it.
Well, let's see if they release everything too on it too. But
No, we just got it. It's not showing up in the forms library.
Yeah.
But one of our agents, one of the title agents, our title processor, Christian, is also a realtor, and he said he got it and then I got it moments before the show.
Okay.
Long story short, there's a video. So if you click on this link, there's a video Florida Association of Realtors just sent out. It's brand new. And the flood disclosures are a function of House Bill 1049. You don't have to remember that, but you do have to remember it's treated just like the seller condo rider. And in the form I actually received moments before the video, it was part of the condo rider. So the good news is it doesn't appear you're going to need a new form. We just need to understand what the revised form looks like and how it works. Only applies to residential transactions, and the seller must disclose if they filed an insurance claim or they received FEMA financial assistance. I have not looked at the form. These are just the big picture takeaways from the video that I watched the other day that they had just released. When I watched it, I was the first viewer. So it's cool when you see something from the Florida Association of Realtors and you're the first person to view it, because it just gives you the feeling you're on top of stuff, or it gave me that feeling. It also defines what a flood is. So there's a whole lot of discussion. Is the leak under my sink a flood? Is the leak in the storm window a flood? And that's all defined in the new statute. And the forms were supposed to be released yesterday, and I have to update it.
¿Puede ser el
Hang on.
jueves
Hey,
o
we're getting-
preferís
somebody's
mañana?
talking. I'm trying to mute her.
Okay,
So
dale, me
just saw-
parece perfecto.
I just saw them now. Now here's the new condo rules. House Book 1021 took effect July 24th.
Bueno, lo pongo 11:30 y vemos.
I got it, Jim. I got it. I found her. All right, go.
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Ryan.
Mhm.
House Bill 1021 took effect July 1st, but the rules go into effect October 1st for us. More than 4 units or more than 3 stories. It defines what the affected properties are better than the original SB 4D. The inspection report copies have to be available to owners within 45 days of receipt. You guys don't have to write this down. We're going to go over everything in detail, and it's going to be in the addendum. And then condos more than 10 units, the board has to meet every quarter at a minimum. So there was a whole lot of gray area when you were dealing with condominium associations where the boards didn't meet regularly and they didn't have agenda and they didn't have rules. All that stuff is agenda or meeting minutes. All that stuff is in the condo rider. And there are more transparency rules due. I wrote 26. This is supposed to be 25. And then Florida Statute 718-407 sub 5. There are going to be disclosures related to condo-tels. If you don't know what a condo-tel is a condominium that's a mixed unit, hotel, motel, and condominium. Again, those forms were out the 23rd, and I just saw them moments ago. All right. Now the moment we've all been waiting for.
Wendy,
the
get a
final-
quick question. If they fill out the seller's disclosure, does that cover us as the agents if they're disclosing about, about the new flooding and the?
No, the seller's disclosure doesn't have prompts. And I believe when we go through the statute, I'll go through the statute before we meet, but I think these prompts are a necessary part of what sellers have to disclose to buyers. What do I mean by prompts? If you guys look at all the new forms, they all have that prompt. They all have that statement that says real estate commissions are fully negotiable and not required by law. I think those are the types of disclosures that aren't included in the old seller's disclosure form that will be included in the new seller's flood and condominium disclosure addendums. The flood addendum looks like it's a whole new addendum, so it is an additional document. All right. With the final goal of uncoupling, everybody remembers what that is.
There's a couple other quick questions, Jim.
Yep.
The new condo rules, is it more than 3 stories or 3 stories or more?
It is more than 3 stories.
Okay, so it'd be basically more than 4 units and more than 3 stories.
I'm sorry. More than 4 units and more than 3 stories. Yes. Yep, I had it right.
Okay.
And we'll Senate Bill 4D and that milestone inspections and budgeting is now a year. Ryan, how long ago was it we talked about those
We were
issues?
way ahead of the curve on that Senate Bill 4D, Jim. We did about 3 different webinars on it, but it was almost a year ago now that we.
It feels like it was a year ago.
Yeah.
Now it's really starting to gain momentum.
I know. No, it's real, guys. And I mean, I haven't, you're starting to see it, right? A reduction in the older condos and the price, right? Because you just have a lot of owners that can't afford the special assessments that came up from the structural integrity tests or the reserve study, and they're selling. And it's ironically what I think is people are more interested now in single family homes and townhomes. So it's put more of a pressure on that type of inventory.
We'll go over, before we part company today, we'll go over some more Senate Bill 4D stuff, more condo milestone and budgeting issues.
So now we're getting into the meat of the webinar here. All right, here we go.
So with uncoupling in mind, FAR's latest attempt to clarify in buyer and seller's mind who's paying for what. There's a Florida Association of Realtors video. I mentioned that a second ago. And here's the new addendum. It's called FF. If anybody's seen this or anybody has thoughts on it, do not hesitate to chime in. I will never be offended by anything that anybody tells me. If I'm corrected, I value that correction. You guys have access to attorneys and brokers that may have other opinions. I'd love to hear it. So with that in mind, no one hesitate to say anything that may be inconsistent with anything I've said. So this is an addendum to the contract. It's labeled FF. It's now in your addendum section in the revised contract, which we'll go over in a minute.
Yep. Which I think most agents use Form Simplicity, which is, through the MLS, right? That which a lot of agents use. All right, keep going.
Yeah. So buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement as may be amended. Buyer, what we call by BBAs, which is not, in capital letters, incorporated herein by this reference. Pause for a second. I have never used the term privity before in a group of real estate agents. Privity is the contractual relationship and duty between two people who sign agreements. And for a million years, we've always had contracts that had commissions stipulated in them. It was always uncomfortable to me because it had a buyer's agent fee and a seller's agent fee, but the buyer's agent and the seller's agent never signed the contract, and agents were always under this notion that they were bound, or they were created rights by the fact that the contract mentioned them and had stipulations to commissions in them. But that is not the case. In order for you to have a contractual right as an agent, you have to have a signed agreement with the person who's going to pay you, signed by the agent and signed by the buyer or seller. So you're going to hear this theme over and over and over, this theme of privity and exactly what they're saying here, how that agreement, the BBA or the listing agreement, is not incorporated herein by reference. And so then you're going to, in this blank here, you're going to just name your brokerage. At closing, seller agrees to credit buyer the sums described below, which for disclosure purposes, only the parties agree is related to buyer's obligation under the BBA. Again, another reference to privity. So here you would put in the percentage of the purchase price and or a dollar amount, or I'm sorry, or a dollar amount, and then here you're going to put in the percentage of the purchase price plus a dollar amount. Here's where it gets tricky. In the event the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by buyer's lender for such contributions, then to the extent permitted by buyer's lender, the balance of the credit will be paid by the seller directly to buyer's broker, or the credit will be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by the buyer's lender. I skipped over this whole center section because I think they put it in an awkward spot. It should have been at the end of the paragraph, and it should have said, if no box is checked, then balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to the buyer broker.
Yes.
Now, we all know the business opportunities for buyers brokers. Everybody's going to want to take that election, and then it would be in contention with the other election, which would have it being reduced to conform to the lender's lending requirements. Now, here's another reference to privity. In the event the credit described above exceeds the limit allowed by the buyer broker agreement, then the credit will be adjusted to the amount allowed under the buyer broker agreement as may be amended. That's confusing to me. What are we doing? Amending the contract, or are we amending the BBA? And I think what is intended is an amendment to the BBA, because it says BBA as may be amended. And I only have a limited screen, so I only see a couple people with their hands up.
Gia has a
I see
question.
Gia's got her hand up, and I'm already nervous because she always comes out of left field with these things I've never thought
Well,
of.
then I do have a question.
Well, that's why I want to do
So
this podcast,
if
because I want to hear your feedback.
we have to now use this form, okay? Does that mean we now have to disclose our BBA to all parties in the transaction?
Good question.
Because
And so
normally-
this last paragraph addresses that. This rider FF shall not modify the BBA, again, going back to privity, or any other compensation agreement made between seller and buyer, seller broker and buyer broker, and nothing in this rider FF requires that buyer or buyer broker to provide a copy of the buyer broker agreement to the seller or seller broker. There's no thing that I've seen in any form, but I want to address your first question too, Gia, because I think
But this
that's
contradicts it.
well.
Because how,
Is
what are
this-
you
your
going to
first
say?
question
Honesty?
was-
Oh, well,
Your first question was, is this form necessary? This form is not necessary. It's not a required form. It was introduced to help at least I haven't heard anything that says it's necessary. And for me, if it was a necessary form, it should be in the contract itself. To me,
Correct.
all the addendums are optional. Do I think there's a clearer way to do business? Yes, but this is a clear indication of an attempt at uncoupling and clarity and things like that. Do I think it's problematic and not necessarily as clear as it could be? Yes. But I also have done a transaction myself personally where I was on the phone with the buyer's agent and the buyer simultaneously, and everybody had conflicting opinions of what would happen if the seller was offering more than the buyer's commission.
More than the BBA.
More
Yeah,
than the
but that-
BBA.
but as a buyer's agent, which I'm not, but when I do work with
Mhm.
buyers, I don't think a buyer would have a problem if the seller's offering 3% and my BBA says 2.5 to sign a modification to now say 3%. Most
And-
buyers are not going to say, no, I'm not going to sign that and, screw you for 0.5%. Most buyers are going to be okay signing that. So my point is, the way this thing reads, even though it says we're not required to provide a copy of it, you're basically saying this is the honor system. If you didn't get your modification, you just take whatever they're saying on the compensation agreement.
Yes and no. So there's an agreement that the buyer and the seller are agreeing to, and then yes, there's a secondary conversation if those amounts differ from the BBA that the BBA has to be modified in accordance with. 100% agree that there's more dialogue that has to happen and a secondary transaction that has to result based on, I won't say the honor system, but you're certainly negotiating in the contract itself. Well, I mean, you bring up a really good point, and that is there's this hierarchy of needs that are supposed to be met in a negotiation conducted by an agent on behalf of their principal. So a buyer or seller is a principal, and you guys are the agents, and that is the needs of the principal are supposed to be met before the needs of the agent. And if you're putting the needs of the agent by negotiating compensations ahead of the needs of the buyer, which is to buy or sell the property, then that's a conflict. And we'll go over how I think is a better way to resolve that in a minute. But yes, I can absolutely see problems, but it does address the one issue of what if the seller is offering more than the BBA contemplates? So where one door opens, where one door closes, we've closed the door on that issue, the gap issue, we've opened up other doors. These are stutter steps, you guys. This is getting to a better FAR bar form. I don't think we're going to have a FAR bar form that agents sign. Ryan, in most commercial transactions that you see, are agents signing the purchase and sale agreement?
No, but it's nice. I mean, the commercial contracts are easy. It's right on the contract of what, you know, the buyer's agent and the listing agent are getting, right? It's written in there, you know, and who's paying it, you know.
But to that point, agents aren't bound. So in other words, buyers and sellers sign a contract on Monday and it says that the agents are getting 10% each, and they revise the contract on Tuesday to say they're getting 0. Agents don't have rights that were impaled, you know, by that
I don't
change.
know. I mean, I've done a lot of commercial transactions. I never had it ever changed, you know, in my, you know, about 15 years of doing commercial, you know, real estate, over 20 doing residential, but I haven't seen it changed.
We used to do a ton of commercial, and just since COVID, it's been almost strictly residential, except for the commercials that are Airbnbs and things like that. But yeah, I would agree. And I don't get calls from agents. Every once in a while, I get calls from commercial agents, but that is the form. It's designed to intersect what happens when the seller's agent is paying more than the BBA contemplates. Here were the notes I put together on it. This form attempts to clarify seller concession overages from the perspective of a lender or the written BBA perspective. Paragraph 4, in the event of credit, that was the paragraph that I said was confusing. Remember the concept of privity, we talked about that, but this is all in the outline, so you guys don't have to take notes. Contract terms don't bind the agents. BBA and listing agreement terms don't bind buyers and sellers. So your terms that you sign and your compensation, your BBAs and your listing agreements don't bind opposing parties.
Yeah.
How at the time of the offer will a buyer know what the lender will allow? That's problematic because it assumes that everybody's well ahead of the ball, and that's not going to happen, and that'll be another thing that comes up later. Last paragraph addresses that old theme of privity, and I can think of no reason that a buyer or seller's agent has to show their listing agreement of the BBA to the, or listing agreement, or should say, or the BBA to the other side, to Gia's point. I see agents doing it, but I don't see anything in the law that requires or compels it or anything that I've seen so far.
Mhm.
So I'm seeing a lot of agents submitting their BBA with the contract, with the compensation agreement, and I wind up with, instead of, you know, a 12, 13 page contract and a couple of riders, to like 40, 50 pages that I'm having to go through
And
with
yes,
all the backup documents and everything else that they're throwing in.
and
Yeah.
I've seen some of the big brokerage, some of the big box brokerages have so many documents that the agents have to get signed. I'm sorry, you guys, I feel for you.
It's way too much.
It's
Too much. I mean, I
And
think
you
that-
do this every single day. Imagine being
I
a
know.
buyer or a seller getting a freaking novel every time they want to make it.
No, I think the best way, Jim, is what we did on the last webinar too, and you can chime in as Gia, is like, write in the additional terms, this contract is contingent on seller side,
I'm gonna show. I'm
saying
gonna go
buyer's
over that in a
agent,
minute. Yeah.
the percent, right? That, and then just get the compensation agreement, whether it's from the seller to the buyer's agent or from the listing agent to the buyer's agent. Depending, you just ask the buyer's agent, you just ask the listing agent, like, who's paying me? Is it you or is it the seller? Because it depends, right? So I think
So that's the perfect
step.
lead into this new form.
Yes.
Mhm.
So this is the new form.
This is GG.
This is
Go
called
up.
GG.
Go up, Jim, so we can
Accepting-
read it. Go all the way to
Say
the
that
top.
again.
Can you go all the way to the top? Because I just want to see what it says at the top.
Yep. Sorry.
God, it's
If-
horrible the way they don't. Why don't they put the name of it at the top? I see it now. It's MGG under the initials. Got it.
Yeah, but it could absolutely be more clear. It's kind of like the listing agreements. They hold the good stuff until the very, out of the form until the very end. It's ridiculous. But anyways, so if initialed by all buyers and parties, the clauses below will be incorporated. We've all seen that before. You name the address, you name the buyer, you name the seller. This contract is contingent upon check one, seller's broker and buyer's broker, or seller and buyer's broker executing a compensation agreement with terms acceptable to buyer. Compensation agreement, that's a defined term. Within blank days, if left blank 3 days after the effective date. Just digesting that is confusing. They're calling that the time period. If the compensation agreement described herein is not executed and delivered within the time period, then the buyer may, within 3 days thereafter, delivering written notice to the seller, terminate the contract, in which event the deposit shall be refunded to buyer, thereby releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations under the contract. If buyer fails to timely deliver said written notice to seller, this contingency shall have no further force or effect. Full
Yeah,
stop.
but this ties the buyer and the seller with the buyer's agent and the seller's agent.
Say that again.
This ties everybody, ties the buyer's agent, the seller's agent.
Well, they're making it options. They're saying we're going to have to negotiate this thing in the future, and it's either going to be between seller and buyer's agent or buyer and buyer's agent, which now again, Gia, you bring something up I hadn't thought of before. There could be a blended payment. So this even makes more confusion if there's a blended payment. The value of doing this thing as a group. Here are my thoughts on this form, and Ryan alluded to it earlier. This is addendum GG, seller's agreement with respect to buyer's broker compensation. You'll see it at the very bottom of your listing of your forms library. So the first one we talked about, FF, is at the top of the forms library. The newest one is at the bottom of the forms library. Do not ask me why they do not list this stuff in the most recent releases, or you can reshuffle it. But anyways, this form is set up as a contingency period of time for agreement on the seller's side compensation of buyer's agent. Notice how I said seller's side. I think this is going to become more and more a theme. I'm seeing it more and more. Not talking about compensate. When you're in negotiation and you're on the buy side, you don't care where the compensation comes from. Why should you have to specify in the negotiation who's paying early on? You just want it to come from the seller's side. You can whittle that down later.
Yep.
Yet another time frame for agents to manage and watch. Why?
Is this going to be in title leap now? Is one of the
What?
drop dates? Jim?
Why?
Like,
Why did the Florida Association of Realtors
Yeah.
make you guys suggest, again, it's not a required addendum, suggest that you guys kick the can down the road on this issue and make another long-term negotiable point? Not sure what it says acceptable to buyer. I should say why. So in the form, it talks about compensation acceptable to buyer. It should be acceptable to the parties, not acceptable to buyer. Everybody has to sign off on it. It's just not artfully drafted. It wasn't well thought out. If there are 3 days to determine the acceptable compensation, why are there 3 more days to give notice? So it's really a 6-day deal in limbo.
Yep.
What does this accomplish You have 3 days to negotiate it. You have 3 days to give notice. So the deal is for 6 days, it's a nothing. And in the meantime, your inspection period is running.
Yeah.
Mind blown. Why would you do this? I'm sorry. The Florida Association of Realtors is doing a good job on some stuff. They're having to hug the road on other issues, but this is, you know, I don't want to sound too extreme and doom and gloom, but there are better ways to do business. Who wants to spend time and effort on inspections if the compensation issue is still up in the air? And in my opinion, more confusion for sellers and buyers. Now you're like explaining to the buyer about this additional negotiation. Like it's hard enough to explain inspections. Now you've got inspections overlaid with compensation. I like this. I like this better. No contingencies, no waiting, no ongoing negotiations. Do it all in the offer. This is exactly what Ryan was talking about.
Yep.
So we came up with this a while ago. I've seen it show up more and more.
I'm using this, guys. I'm using this in every single deal. I haven't had a problem as a buyer's agent doing this. Actually, the listing agents love it. And then I just go ahead, Jim. Go for it.
No,
I mean, I did. This is very powerful and it's very easy. Very easy.
I think tales from the street, I call it, are the most important thing we can all do together because everybody feels a little intimidated or whatever. Is anybody else doing this? Ryan says he's doing it. I'm not going to tell you I invented it, but I haven't heard it from any place else, but it's obvious. Other agents have to have other
Angela's using it. Angela's using it. Okay, go ahead, Jim. Let's
other
break it.
consultants have to be mentioning it, I'm sure, to you guys. In paragraph 20 in the contract, right, this contract is contingent on seller side paying buyer's agent 3% of the purchase price at closing or whatever commission you want. Have your buyer sign it. Remember we were talking a little bit before about the hierarchy of importance. The needs of the client have to be ahead of the needs of the agent. If you don't, it's a conflict of principal agent duties. If you do it this way, the buyer signs the offer. The buyer is giving the endorsement that these are perfect terms in their mind. They could never come back later and say, you were conflicted by putting your needs ahead of mine. Does that make sense to you guys? That's an important theme to make a distinction on. It's getting the simultaneous needs of the agent and the client met simultaneously.
Yep.
Send the offer to the seller's agent. With the offer, send over the buyer's agent compensation agreement with the same percentage as the contract offer. I like the seller to buyer agent as a default starting place because many of the brokerages are moving towards seller paying buyer's agent.
Ask the broker though, ask the listing agent, because I just had one, like I'm literally doing an inspection after our webinar here, meeting that he's actually, it's the brokerage, right? That's paying the buyer's agent. So I just
There are
asked him.
some, yeah.
Alex has a question. Go ahead, Alex.
Hey, guys, thank you. So I don't know if I'm asking this correctly, but if I'm an agent, which I am, and I'm telling all my buyers that my commission is 3%, aren't I then putting my needs ahead of the buyer? And that's it. You know, if I'm granted, they have the opportunity to go elsewhere, but if I say this is my commission, hands down, am I now putting my needs before the buyer?
I can see that. I can see that argument being made in a larger picture discussion. But if you're getting ahead of your buyer, I think that when you're getting your BBA signed, you're setting your standard, and that's not necessary. You're just telling a buyer, here's what I require for my employment.
Okay.
The agent down the street might be 1%, another agent might be 4%, but this is what I require. So you're putting them on notice early on, and I think that kind of vacates or blunts that argument. But to your point, Alex, I've heard lots of discussions where that has been a topic of the discussion, and high-level brokerages at big boxes are batting just that issue around. And we're going to get in, when I talk about parting thoughts, we're going to get into some stuff that you guys, I stress, you guys have to be critical thinkers. And the fact that you're thinking in those terms, Alex, I commend you.
Thanks, I think.
I don't want you to get
a headache.
I don't want you to get pulled, over analysis leads to paralysis. That was in law school. They told us that over and over and over. Civil procedure was the most overwhelming class you could take, and the best way to proceed was just to start proceeding. And I don't want us to get into the rabbit hole of overanalyzing everything, but we have to be critical thinkers. I see a couple of hands up. I'm sorry, I'm on a reduced screen.
Yeah, Brian, you have a question? Go ahead, you can unmute. There you
Yes,
go.
just wanted to follow up with questions. So to kind of piggyback on what Alex said, my when I'm sitting there with a consumer who's a buyer, and we reach an agreement that let's say my compensation is 4%, and we go and see a house, and the buyers say, "Yep, this is a house," and the or the seller's broker is offering a compensation of 2.5%. That means then that the 2.5% is collected, and at closing, from my buyers, I collect the additional 1.5%, correct? Because we've agreed that it's going to be 4%.
It depends.
And let me tell you, the reason I'm asking is because we got a thing from compliance saying, well, are you going to send a notification reducing your commission?
This is exactly what
answer
this
was
form was.
no.
This is exactly what this form was aimed at. How do you handle those gaps?
Yeah, I mean, well, they agreed to, my thing was if they agreed to this and I tell them, I will try everything I can to get the compensation from the seller's agent
Yeah.
or seller. However, if that's not the case, you agree that you will pay me either this money or the gap there that exists between what they're paying and what
I'm
they.
sorry, I thought you were talking about the gap where seller is paying for more than what the BBA.
No. There I know
You're
I can
talking
only.
about-
Yeah, no,
You're
no.
talking about the gap
Yes.
that occurs when a BBA
Yes.
is stated for more than the seller concession.
Absolutely, because the other one, I tell them, hey, if they offer 5 and we agree on 4, I can't collect 5. I can only collect what we agree on. But so that's it. But the other one is the gap if they're not meeting what our.
Yeah, that's gonna be explained by what I call the doctor's agreement contract. So everybody goes to the doctors, and this is something everybody can relate to. And so when you talk about making things palatable, understandable, you want to come up with examples that everybody can relate to. And you say, this is just like the agreement when you go to your doctor's office. And they let you know that if insurance doesn't cover the cost of the appointment, that you're going to have to cover it. And I've heard other agents call it the doctor's agreement, doctor's insurance agreement. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about the gap the other way, Brian.
Mhm.
There's another question. I see a hand up, Ryan, but I'm not sure whose it is.
Wendy had a question.
Lay it on us, Wendy.
Hi, sorry, my dog's barking. I just wanted to ask, I know Ryan and a couple other agents have used that contract is contingent on the seller line. Have you had any pushback when you've also needed to ask for concessions for like a roof or anything else? Have you had pushback on having both of those on the contract?
So Wendy, funny you say that, to this deal that I'm actually going to the inspection after this, hopefully nothing inspection, but the buyer actually asked for 3% seller concession in the additional terms to cover closing costs and prepaid items, along with the 2.5, to the buyer's agent, which is me, and there was no pushback at all. I mean, we came in actually, right at list price. You know what I mean? So, I talked to the listing agent. I asked if there's any room there, and he kind of hinted that there was like, $10,000-$15,000 in room, as far, and he said he was offering 2.5 agent buyer's commission. So that's why I wrote that in there. And then, yeah.
We
I
had
asked-
such a hard time, Tajay and I, building this tool, trying to come up with a tool that could capture all those scenarios, Wendy. And the only way we could come up with it was to come up with boxes for a realtor commission, for a seller commission, for a concession, and a transaction fee. So where once you had 1 or 2 boxes, now you've got 4. and you have to sit and think about it a little bit, but you can certainly give illustrations to your clients about how to use the tools and what the additional concessions look like. But certainly there's no law precluding a contract that says we're going to pay a buyer's agent X, and then during the inspection period, we're going to pay concessions of a little bit more because we found the pool pump doesn't work or whatever the case may be. But I like the fact that you guys are in here, because if anybody has examples like Ryan's where this stuff happens in the street, I like to hear about those examples as much as anything.
Well, the unknown now is the inspection, because it is tight. My buyers have only 3% to close this deal. I'm hoping nothing pops up, but we might come into a barrier there yet. We'll find out today.
We got another hand up, Ryan. I'm not sure who it is.
DeMonico. No, I think he's had his hand up for a while.
All right.
Anyway, Jeff, did you have anything you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, how does the seller concession affect, like if the buyer has is financing or getting a mortgage and there's limits on seller concession? Is that handled in separate entities? Is it included? I mean, because seller can't give concession for down payment because obviously it affects the price of the house, but how is that going to work?
So one of the things we've talked about in past podcasts was buyer's agents have to make sure, and even if you're a seller's agent, that the lender underwriter is not getting confused between concessions and buyer brokerage compensation.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that this thing tries to clarify. This form tries to clarify. Do I think it could do a better job? Absolutely. But that's what they're getting at. And certainly you could stroke an addendum between the parties. I'm thinking of this agile on my feet, which is always dangerous, but you could certainly stroke an addendum between the parties to clarify, memorialize X percent is being paid to buyer's agent. But that's also going to be clarified in the compensation agreement. So
Yeah.
scratch that. You wouldn't need an addendum. You could just send your lender a copy of the compensation agreement. And although we talk about not sharing BBAs and listing agreements, you would share compensation agreements.
But does that affect the amount or the percentage that the seller can give based on the mortgage that's being received?
I shook my head no, and
included?
I shook my head no, and I meant to say yes. It affects it to the extent that the seller can pay it, and it shouldn't affect lender underwriting. Now, when I say shouldn't affect, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I was just gonna say on this exact deal that I had, I spoken to the lender because we're asking for a seller credit to cover the buyer's closing costs, and he said 3%. I said, is that what they need? He said, yeah, get 3%. So I did. But my compensation's coming from the seller side which is actually the listing agent. It's not coming from the seller, right?
But more particularly, it's going to the buyer's agent, not to the buyer.
Correct. So it doesn't. I think maybe we can get more than 3% if we can. I mean, most lenders,
yes,
they're doing a 3% conventional deal. It's not FHA. It's actually conventional. So I don't know. Is there a limit on that, Jeff, on conventional of how much percent credit you can get from a seller for a buyer?
Well,
yeah, and I think it has to do with the amount of the down payment.
Okay, well, they're only doing 3%. They're only doing 3% down, so they're doing 97% financing.
I mean, here's a real interesting, and there's a thing called corner cases when you're developing, and you don't want to build software that addresses just these remote possibilities. Same thing happens when you generate forms. But here's what Jeff's talking about. The credit will be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by buyer's lender. So now you're in the middle of the transaction. You're having to reduce these amounts. You have to go back and renegotiate BBAs. I mean, it's just it's hard. I don't want to water it down, you guys. This stuff is hard.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
All right, there's a new contract form. The new contract form, the only thing that I can figure out that's different about the new contract form that's wasn't in the let's see, stay logged in. This broker listing and cooperating brokers, if any. So this last section above what used to be the compensation section, listing and cooperating brokers, if any, named below, collectively broker, are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with this contract. If you've got referring people, this doesn't, you know, if you're paid, they've got to be listed here. If they're not, you've got to put in referees and things like that. Instructions to closing agent, this is a new one on us. Seller and buyer direct agreement, it's closing agent to disclose at closing. Let me blow this up a little bit, I'm sorry. Even I'm struggling, not even I am struggling. Seller and buyer direct closing agent to disperse at closing the full amount of the brokerage fees as specified in separate brokerage agreements with the parties and cooperating agreements between the brokers. I think those are the compensation agreements. Do not ask me why they put that in there if it wasn't, except to the extent broker has retained such fees from escrowed funds. That would be in the case of a default. This contract shall not modify any offer of compensation made between seller or listing broker and cooperating brokers. Again, the concept of privity, you're going to see this over and over, this uncoupling, this clarifying, but this is a very confusing statement. Suffice it to say, from our perspective as a title agent, all we need is what we call DAs, distribution authorities. We do not want you to send us your compensation agreements, but I want to make you aware that that paragraph is in there. And to the extent it states this separate brokerage agreements with the parties and cooperating agreements between the brokers, that sounds like compensation agreements. It sounds like they want you to send us compensation agreements. That doesn't work for us. We need distribution authorities, DAs. Go ahead. I think it's Gia has her hand up.
Yeah. Question. You just said that where it says on line 639 of that contract, if you go back, listing cooperating brokers of any name below are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with this contract. And you mentioned referring agents would also be included in that. Is that correct? I mean, in other words, if we get a referral from an agent in a different state, I'm having to disclose that as well.
You guys, I mean, I've said things that have not resonated well with parties and authority drafting the contract. The first one was when I said, under the BBA and the showing agreement, if a buyer cancels during the inspection period, the commission to the buyer's agent is still due. I contacted the Florida Association of Realtors and talked to a Florida Association of Realtors attorney, and they were as baffled that they hadn't contemplated it as I, and pointed it out. And by the end of the conversation, they said, "Yes, Jim, you're right." Even though they did not want to concede that at the end. I'm not saying I'm you know, any great soothsayer on this stuff. I'm just saying the words are obvious to me. And if you have, with regard to this, if you have somebody who referred you a deal from another state, it says to me that they're supposed to be revealed in the agreement.
Huh. Isn't that charming? So any of the third party referring sites that refer us, even if it's Zillow,
There's something I hadn't thought of again.
whatever. I mean, if they're getting a referral,
yeah,
whatever,
How far
whoever
does
is
it go?
that's my point. How far down the rabbit hole does it go?
Poorly conceived and illy produced, not thoroughly conceived and ill production.
That's the dumbest thing I've heard so far.
This is what we have to work with.
Okay.
it's funny. I
Alright.
just saw that the contract I did on this weekend, it has that in there.
Yeah, it just came out. Oh, that's another thing I want to point out to you guys. Holy cow. How long did we used to sit with forms? The last form we were given was revised 7/24. This is 8/24. The forms are being revised monthly. It's
A
unconceivable.
lot.
God, I'm glad you pointed
Wow.
this out, Jim. I mean, I actually signed a contract and I didn't even read that. Like I mean, the buyers, I see it in there right now. I pulled up the contract. Wow.
Flattery will
luck-
get you everywhere with me, Ryan. That's my highest form of flattery.
Dude, you're the best, Jim. I mean, thank you so much, man. Jesus.
Well, I'm not trying to blow smoke in my wind in my own sails, but when I brought to the Florida Association of Realtors the fact that is that the showing agreement and the BBA obligate the buyer to pay compensation if they cancel during the inspection period. That was a mind blower from what I could tell. And this is a mind blower from what I can tell. And I'm going to have to, and not going to have to, I'm going to bring it to the attention of the Florida Association of Realtors. We'll see.
Yeah, because look at, think about Realtor has Op City, right? If you, I don't know if you guys have ever used them for buyer's agent leads, but they take a percentage of every deal, right, that they give you.
Correct.
You know what
Who's
I mean?
getting
So it's like,
compensation, and then how do you define narrowly? We just mean compensation, like first tier compensation, second tier, like it just, the rabbit hole never ends.
Well, if you get a referral for the seller side, or even, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you have to pay a 25% referral fee because you got a listing, now I've got to not just disclose it, the seller would know because they know who was referring you, but then
Buyer's
you've got to
agent,
let
the buyer
everybody
has
else
to-
know.
Yeah. I don't think it's proper. I don't think
It
it's
really isn't. I mean, you may as well just give them your CRM and say, here, this is, I mean,
dig in.
not for nothing.
I
Right.
know.
All right.
Anyway,
I haven't
Jim, I've
found
got to
any-
go. I've got a listing appointment. Now that I know I
Okay.
have to disclose everything.
Yeah.
Goodbye. I'll talk to
Kill
you
it.
later. Thanks.
So
Thanks,
do we have
Thea.
another one? Ryan, it looks like somebody else has their hand up.
Well, Wendy, did we get your question? Or do you have another one?
I was just say with referrals, aren't you signing an agreement? Like my brokerage is signing an agreement with the referring broker. So wouldn't that create our own separate agreement? So that wouldn't necessarily be pertinent to disclosing the referring agent in the contract, right? Or am I wrong there?
I wouldn't say you're wrong, and I wouldn't say you're right. I would just tell you the way I read this thing under the plain terms of what it says. Everybody who's getting compensated, I have this foolish thing that pops down on my screen because I'm not doing it with my dual screens for my office. Everybody who's receiving compensation, let's see, are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with the contract. I guess you could read it narrowly and say brokers is a capital B, and okay, yeah, listing agent and cooperating brokers are the only brokers, listing and cooperating brokers. So you can narrow it to just the person who listed it and just the person who's cooperating are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with the contract. I don't think it's worded as well
I
as
mean,
it
what is
goes.
the agreement between Op City and your brokerage? I mean, is that, I mean, what kind is that? It's just a referral agreement. So, you know, it's a good question. You know, it's a good one. I mean, but they're getting paid from the transaction, right? They're getting paid from your broker directly, not on the HUD, right? Not, I mean, not on the closing statement.
They're getting paid after that broker gets paid, like first tier and
Exactly.
second tier broker.
But it goes back to this decoupling, like, you know, and this transparency, which it's funny now where, you know, where the listing, where the buyer's broker commission isn't listed anywhere, where it's less transparent, but like, you know, this decoupling of wanting the sellers wanting to know who's all getting paid in this transaction, right? Anyway, I digress.
Parting thoughts. I wish Gia was here for this. This is a big one. Condominium and special assessments are a big issue in the sale of every condo we're seeing, or every older condo we're seeing. We'll go over this in the next show, or possibly maybe the show after that. We'll go do a show October 1st on the new laws. But in every single transaction we're seeing, special assessments, the meeting minutes 1 year prior to the sale, the agenda, the printed agenda of the board 1 year prior to the sale, pending special assessments that are levied, all those little terms in the condominium rider, which appears have just been amended. Every agent on both sides of the deal has to know how those work. Jeff Stewart was asking a little while ago about compensation in favor of buyer's agents. Yeah, as a buyer's agent, you have to be able to enumerate that to your lender. But as a seller's agent, you have to be aware of the issues so you can point that out to the buyer's agent if it's potentially submarining the deal. So you have to know both sides of the transaction. And as a seller's agent, you have to know what was in the agenda, what was in the meeting minutes, what's been levied. But you also, as a buyer's agent, have to know those same things. because these amounts are huge. We saw a little one the other day for 20 grand. I know one that's 90 grand special assessments. I know another one that's a little bit over $100,000 special assessment that's in discussion in the meeting minutes. Those things all have to be revealed to a buyer in the contract, or they become the duty of the seller post-closing if they weren't disclosed.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
I mean, we can do a whole another webinar on this, Jim, you
Yeah.
know, about the new condo.
So
you
the,
know.
the condo thing is definitely going to come up again. And I've got some language that we can put in the contract when you represent buyers to make sure your buyer's getting off the hook in the future. It's
Mhm.
kind of like bulletproofing the whole permit thing like we did before,
Yep.
the permit issue. We can
Yep.
do that for the condo issue, and I'll give you the language.
Yeah, which I do that on every deal. Yeah, when I'm a buyer's agent with the permit stuff. That was a
But
good
as
thing.
a sell, yeah, that's all commonplace now, right? We all
Yeah,
just
I know.
do it automatically. The condo thing is going to have to go the same way, but as a selling agent, you have to be ahead of the ball. You have to know what's in the meeting minutes. You have to know what's in the agenda items. You have to know what's levied. You have to know those things. And I've even had some agents tell me, I don't want to know about it until the contract is drafted. By then, everybody's contacted moving trucks and inspectors and all those things, and it's just another thing. I suggest to you guys, we want to be the agents ahead of the ball. I won't harp on it anymore. We're at 11:09. Clear cooperation rules, they're under fire. If anybody doesn't know what clear cooperation, it's the rules that are out there. Ryan, you better explain them than me. Go
Well,
ahead.
this is like, no, multiple MLSs now are getting sued where, the MLS, which, the beaches has it, you're supposed to put the listing in as soon as you get the listing agreement within a certain time into the MLS. They're saying that's forced cooperation. There's, they're getting sued on that. Also, too, a lot of MLSs now are getting sued by different brokerage groups of making it mandatory that you have to join NAR to have access to the MLS. So,
I don't understand why all of that isn't a restraint on trade.
yep. I know.
In my mind, it is, and I want to see that new FTZ czar. I can't remember her name, the 32-year-old
Mhm.
girl. I think it's Lydia or Lacey or something.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. If we have no cooperation agreement here on the MLSs, why are they making it mandatory within 48 hours of a listing agreement that we have to put it onto the MLS?
Why can't a seller sell and you keep it in their pocket and the agent keeps it in
I
their
mean,
pocket?
yeah.
All right, so this next section I call life under a microscope. This isn't meant to scare you guys. This is just something to be aware of. More so than ever, agents have to watch carefully what they say. A judge recently threw out a summary judgment allowing a lawsuit from a buyer against the buyer's agent for statements the buyer's agent left in the showing comments that made the seller upset and led to the seller not giving concessions during the inspection period. How did this come out? Apparently, when seller and buyer were at the closing table, seller said something like, had you not insulted us in the showing comments, we would have cut you a break. Very important that agents don't give opinions. They only give original thoughts of their buyers and sellers. Agents must always be conduits of their client's position, never original thought. And if the showing agent is hammering you for showing comments, maybe you don't even answer. But just know that we are being carefully scrutinized. There are more lawyers looking at our space than ever. I'm not a big fan of lawyers, but they are looking at our space. And for a judge to allow this, I think is a loud statement that the level of scrutiny that agents have to operate from under. Does everybody know what the scenario was? The agent said something like in the showing comments, like my buyer was really upset and you know that you were so hard. I think it was my buyer was really upset that you guys were so hard to negotiate the purchase price on or something. And so that led to the seller taking a position they weren't going to give concessions during the inspection period.
I mean, it's all here. I mean, they could have just used that, but, could have been made up. All right.
If you guys are representing buyers, you can always put us in paragraph 20 as the closing agent. We'd love to work for you. Buyers agency, sellers choosing title agents is by custom, not by law. you can still put us in paragraph 20. New path title is the closing agent, capital C, capital A. It's a defined term. And then you can still leave it with the seller paying for title. When you make the offer, now the title agent is chosen and the buyer can have their way. So if you're making an offer and you're representing a buyer and you want us to close for you, in paragraph 20, you can write the closing agent is new path title. The seller will still pay and we'll close for you. You'll get title leap and all that stuff that we give. I've got a ton more I can go over, but we're at 11:13 and I'm not gonna.
No, Jim, thank you guys. Thanks for this, Jim. I mean, having an attorney perspective, especially on these new changes. I mean, it's like you said, it's now every month that we're having new changes, new forms, keeping up to date. It's too much. We have an attorney that's reading all the forms, that's going over this. It's pretty awesome, Jim. Definitely, if you haven't, check out New Path Title. I use them for every closing that I have. You know, especially when I'm the listing agent, you get a free contract coordinator with the closing software. Title Leap, we also have awesome Title Advance, which is basically there's no surprises now on title if there's some kind of crazy lien. Jim offers this for free, guys, to us agents for Title Advance. It saved me in a couple of deals where, you know, the listings were super skinny and, you know, it wouldn't have made sense. The seller would have to bring money to closing. So I just, you know, didn't spend the brain calories on working on that listing. It saved me a lot of time, a lot of effort. Title Advance, check that out. It's free service that Jim checks out. Also, too, guys, if you're not on, get on Real Trade. You can get free leads. We got thousands of buyers and sellers on there. I just heard an agent again last week that got a direct buyer on their listing on Real Trade. We share your information. You're the point of contact as a listing agent. Also, too, there you are on a Search Pros feature. So if buyers do need a buyer's agent, they can discover you not only in the Search Pros, but on the social feature. And then, of course, you can get connected with all the awesome service providers like Jim, like Jeff on there. So that's what I wanted to say there on closing statements there, Jim.
You guys can contact me 24/7 if you go to newpathtitle.com. There's a little button that you can click that says contact an attorney. 24-hour transactional support I offer you guys. Like I said earlier in the show, I learn as much as you learn, if not more, because it gives me food for thought. I'm going to drill down further on that section in the contract about the brokerages and who's getting paid. And we'll come up with more definitive answers on that. But that's the stuff, that's the value.
Amazing value, Jim.
Perspectives, it helps everybody operate in a much more professional environment. TO Capital, we're doing a lot of hard money loans lately. We're doing a lot of creative finance. We're doing a lot of at the title company with the law firm. We're doing seller financing more than I've ever seen before. I wanted to bring Tajay and Christian in to bring you guys into some great examples of real world BBAs and all these commission issues being sorted out. We'll have to do it the next show. There's just too much stuff, but just know that this stuff is working. BBAs
Awesome.
are working. The listing agreements, the revised listing agreements with the 10A and the 10B election are working, and the little language tips we've given you, they are working. We're seeing it in real life. Nobody has anything further. I'm going to go back to.
Thank you, Jim. I mean, it's just like, you know, it's all great information, and we're staying on the forefront. And this is info that we're not getting anywhere else. I mean, that's what the cool thing is on it.
Well, I appreciate that.
Appreciate all, Jim. This is Nancy. Can I call you in a few minutes? I've had a couple deals that have been really tough, and it's all about negotiating. They take out the buyers.
Send me a text. The best thing is, and I'll call you right back if you send me the text. There's a bunch of people that's going to call simultaneously. It happens every show. But as soon as you text me, I'll get right back to you in the order that people are texting.
Okay, it's regarding negotiations happening by eliminating the buyer's commission.
Yep.
And what my obligations are as a buyer's agent to go
Sounds like
back.
a principal agent conflict issue. I'd love to talk about it.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Ryan.
You guys.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys.